Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. And with the post-Brexit talks about to get underway with not only the EU, but other countries around the world as well, I thought I'd run a little series on what the main thoughts will be for the various countries based on public statements and importance of different aspects of trade for the Brexit process. And first up will be the UK itself. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, first of all, this is probably going to be the most complicated of all nations because our government says one thing and does another. So I'm going to base this only on what they say that is consistent with what they're also doing. Also, when I say what the UK want, of course, I'm referring to the UK government and not necessarily the population at large, and certainly not businesses based in Britain. But that's going to be the case for every country, really, isn't it? They are the ones who produce starting negotiating positions and then finalise the actual agreements at the end of the process. So what the UK government wants from Brexit, above all else, is deregulation. Boris Johnson, as well as key allies and donors in the Conservative Party, have made it clear that they wish to deregulate the financial sector completely. There have also been recent and wholly predictable moves to remove regulations protecting worker rights and environmental standards as well. But the main prize has always been the City of London financial centre. So when someone gave Boris Johnson a crayon and asked him to pen a deal with the EU in terms of what he'd ideally like, he said he wanted a free trade deal without having to follow any EU rules. And that's essentially it. Except, of course, it isn't quite possible. You don't have to follow the rules exactly, but there has to be what's called equivalence. We have to have laws in place that do the same job as the other key EU laws, not all of them, of course. So what he then said is, well, he'd quite like a Canada-style deal, which means that most goods are tariff and quota free. It's largely free trade, but it's not completely free trade. Because when you have any deal that is less than 100% tariff and quota free, it means you have to go down each individual commodity and decide which will and will not be free. When you look at between Canada and the EU, it's about 98% of goods are tariff and quota free. And you think, we only have to work out 2% of them then. No, you don't. You have to work out all of them because you have to decide which ones are going to be quota and tariff free. And that's why it took 7 years. Also, under such a system, there have to be checks at the border. Now, this exists between the EU and Canada right now, of course, because it's not completely free trade, and would have to exist between the UK and the EU, which it doesn't currently. But Boris Johnson insists that there will be no checks. And he seems to mean it as well, because he hasn't actually even begun to expand the border force necessary to carry out these checks, in which case he doesn't actually want a Canada-style deal. So when people point out that although Boris Johnson says he wants a Canada-type deal, but that he's also ruling out all the actual aspects of that deal, potentially he doesn't really want it. He then counters by saying, well, I'll accept an Australia-style deal. Okay, so what sort of deal does Australia have with the EU? Is this a free trade deal? No. They are working on it. The EU and Australia have started negotiations on a free trade agreement. They did that about a year or two ago, but that's very much underway. That's not the deal that they have now. It's quite a loose agreement at the moment with the intention, as I say, of seeking a free trade agreement in time. But right now, there are checks, tariffs, quotas, and crucially for the UK, the services sector doesn't really have much access to the European markets. So if we adopted such a model, it would mean that our businesses would have to pay customs duties, which we currently don't. We wouldn't be able to get EU contracts, which we currently can, and our protected foods would no longer be protected. You know, for example, Melton Mowbray pork pies would no longer have to be made in Melton Mowbray to be sold as such, at least in Europe. Things like that. Goods that we export to the EU will have to meet their standards, of course, but that's the case for selling products to any country on earth. So diversion of rules, which Boris Johnson says he intends to go through with, would mean that every year that goes by and there's more and more divergence, will be harder and harder to trade with the EU as well, until we stop doing that. Now, coming back to that deregulation of the financial sector, this is the prize. It is intended to make London's financial operators more competitive and, of course, by being more competitive, attract more business. However, the EU will not allow Britain to do this and have access to its markets because it would just lose all of its business to Britain. That's not really what it sees in a post-Brexit future. And as the influential people in the UK right now are adamant about the deregulation of financial services, it seems that it will be impossible to get a deal with the EU at all. So what about other countries? Well, the UK government is very keen on a US trade deal. That would mean being forced to abandon certain standards on foods, worker rights and environmental protections in order to be able to import the American goods that do not currently meet standards in one or more of those areas. That suits the UK government at the moment. In addition, the Americans want to insist that public money is spent as a priority on goods and services that were produced in the United States. For example, we know this one, the NHS would have to buy drugs from the USA if they were available there at the massively inflated prices. They wouldn't be allowed to choose the cheaper supplier, for example. Naturally, the UK government wouldn't be as keen for that to happen. There's no benefit to them, but they may accept it in order to get the deregulation that is an essential component of the US trade deal. The UK would ideally like to see a free trade deal with the US, much as with every other country, but that's not what America is offering. Essentially, the UK's post-Brexit trade aims are completely free trade with any country that will sign up to such an agreement, believing that our race to the bottom on standards will just naturally make us more competitive and so the big winner in such an arrangement. Many people have a philosophical objection to protectionism in the world, of course, when it comes to trade. The Conservative Party would definitely be in favour of removing all barriers to trade. They'd be fine with that, completely free market access to the whole world. The question is whether other countries would go for it. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then also please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.